One winter night, everything ended, and yet nothing was resolved. Fayetteville, West Virginia, Christmas Eve, 1945. A quiet Appalachian town settles into sleep beneath a pale winter sky. The war that had consumed the world for years has finally ended. Soldiers are home. Factories are slowing. Families across America are learning how to live without fear again. In Fayetteville, life is modest and hard-earned. Coal trucks move along Route 16. Porch lights glow faintly against the cold. Houses dot the hillsides, each holding its own small version of hope. Christmas Eve is not loud here. It is gentle, familiar, predictable. On a slope overlooking the road stands a two-story wooden house. Inside, a family finishes another ordinary holiday evening. Children laugh, then settle. Dishes are washed. Lights are turned off one by one. The house exhales as sleep takes hold. Tomorrow is Christmas morning. Nothing about the night suggests danger. Nothing hints that this house will not see daylight again. The Sodder family has survived much already: immigration, poverty, war. They believe the hardest chapters are behind them. The parents trust the walls they built. The children trust the night. Safety feels complete. After midnight, the house grows still. Winter presses in from outside, but inside there is warmth. Bodies under blankets, breath rising and falling in quiet rhythm. The upstairs bedrooms hold dreams of toys and morning excitement. Then, somewhere in the dark, something changes. It does not announce itself. There is no explosion, no crash of glass, no sudden scream. The fire begins silently. It grows behind walls, feeding on dry wood, climbing unseen through hidden spaces. Smoke thickens gradually, creeping upward into sleeping rooms. The air grows heavy long before heat is felt. Fire does not always arrive violently. Sometimes it arrives patiently. By the time it reveals itself, it is already too late. In the early hours of December 25th, the Sodder house ignites from the inside out. Flames race along beams and ceilings, turning familiar rooms into corridors of heat and smoke. The structure becomes a furnace, collapsing inward with terrifying speed. A mother wakes choking, confused, then instantly aware that something is terribly wrong. A father runs into the freezing night barefoot, his breath burning as he turns back toward the flames again and again. Neighbors will later recall the glow on the hillside, brighter than any Christmas light, pulsing against the darkness, visible from the road below. Panic fractures the night. 2 children escape through a window. The parents escape, but 5 do not. Names are shouted into smoke-filled rooms. Voices vanish into heat. Windows are broken in desperation. A ladder is searched for and is not where it should be. A truck is started and fails. Every attempt to reach the upper floor collapses under the speed of the blaze. The fire does not slow. It consumes the house with brutal efficiency. Floors give way. Walls collapse. The roof caves inward. What was a home minutes earlier becomes an enemy, sealing off exits, deciding outcomes without mercy. Calls for help fail. The phone does not work. The volunteer fire department does not arrive in time. Hours pass as the structure burns itself to the ground. By the time assistance reaches the hill, there is nothing left to save. The fire has already finished its work. Dawn approaches reluctantly, as if unsure whether it should rise at all. What remains is a blackened foundation, still warm beneath the winter air. Twisted bed springs mark where bedrooms once stood. Chimney stones lie scattered like broken teeth. Everything that defined a family's life has collapsed inward, reduced to ash and debris. The parents do not leave. They stand in the ruins, stunned, hollow, refusing to move. Shock delays grief. Disbelief holds it at bay. They begin digging with bare hands and borrowed tools, searching where their children slept only hours before. They expect to find remains. They brace themselves for it, because death,
as unbearable as it is, leaves something behind. But as the ashes are sifted and debris cleared, something impossible becomes clear. There are no bones, no skull fragments, no teeth, not a single trace that 5 human bodies were ever present. This was not a small fire. It burned intensely and for hours. It destroyed the entire structure. And yet, where experts say remains should almost always be found, there is nothing. The absence is louder than the flames ever were. Authorities soon offer an explanation. The fire, they say, burned hot enough to destroy everything. The children perished completely. Nothing survived. The explanation is delivered quickly, cleanly, comfortably. But to the parents standing in the ashes, it does not ring true. Because fires leave evidence, and this one did not. Within days, death certificates are issued. The case is quietly closed. Paperwork replaces questions. Official conclusions demand acceptance. The Sodders refuse. They remember things that do not align. A strange phone call after midnight, a loud impact on the roof, a ladder missing when it was needed most, a truck that would not start, phone lines that did not work, help that never came, witnesses who later describe unfamiliar cars, unfamiliar faces, strange activity in the night, and always the same impossible fact: no bodies, no graves, no proof. As weeks pass, the ashes cool, the hill turns green again. Fayetteville moves on, absorbing the tragedy into local memory before letting it fade. But for the Sodder family, time stops. Christmas never comes quietly again. Every year reopens the same wound. Every passing decade adds distance from the night, but not clarity. Grief hardens into something heavier: uncertainty. Because grief allows mourning, uncertainty demands vigilance. The Sodders begin asking questions no parent should ever have to ask. What if the children were not in the house? What if the fire was not an accident? What if the flames were meant to destroy evidence, not lives? These questions will follow them for the rest of their lives. The case will not remain confined to one town or one winter night. It will stretch across decades, across state lines, across generations. It will appear on billboards, in newspapers, in whispered conversations along highways. Not because a house burned, but because 5 children vanished without a trace. The fire ended before sunrise. The mystery did not. And as the smoke lifted from the hillside in Fayetteville, something far more disturbing took its place. A silence heavy enough to last a lifetime. 5 children disappeared. No graves were dug. No answers were given. And the question that remains still echoes through the hills of West Virginia. What really happened to the Sodder children?
Before the fire, before the mystery, before their name became inseparable from unanswered questions, the Sodders were simply a family trying to build a life. Their story did not begin in Fayetteville, West Virginia. It began across an ocean in southern Italy, where hardship was common and opportunity was scarce. Like millions of others in the early 20th century, George Sodder left his homeland with little more than determination and a belief that somewhere else effort might finally be rewarded. America represented that possibility. George arrived in the United States as a young man, carrying with him the discipline of survival and the quiet resilience forged by poverty. He worked relentlessly, taking whatever jobs were available, learning quickly, saving carefully. Over time, he made his way to West Virginia, a state shaped by coal, labor, and endurance. It was not an easy place to live, but it was a place where hard work could still build something solid. In Fayetteville, George found his footing. He established a hauling and trucking business, transporting coal and materials throughout the region. The work was demanding and constant, but it was reliable. George earned a reputation for honesty and dependability, traits that mattered deeply in a town where trust was currency. He paid his bills. He kept his word. He built relationships slowly, deliberately. Jennie Sodder's story followed a similar path. She too immigrated from Italy, bringing with her strong traditions centered on family, structure, and responsibility. She believed in routine, discipline, and care, values that would later define the Sodder household. Together, George and Jennie formed a partnership rooted less in romance than in shared purpose. They were builders, not just of a business, but of a home. The Sodders' house sat on a hillside overlooking Route 16, visible but not isolated. It was a wooden, two-story structure, modest by modern standards, but substantial for a working-class immigrant family. It was a symbol of stability, proof that the sacrifices had mattered. Inside, the house was rarely quiet. George and Jennie had 10 children over the years. Their home was crowded, busy, and full in every sense of the word. Older children helped raise younger ones. Responsibilities were shared. Meals were loud. Conversations overlapped. Privacy was limited, but connection was constant. This was not a fragile family. It was a resilient one. George believed deeply in education and independence. He encouraged his children to think for themselves, to speak confidently, and to value effort over entitlement. Jennie ensured structure, meals on time, chores completed, traditions honored. Together, they created a household that balanced discipline with affection. Neighbors saw the Sodders as hard-working and respectable. Their children were known in the community. They attended school, played with others, and moved easily through the rhythms of small-town life. The Sodders were not outsiders. They were part of Fayetteville's fabric. Yet, beneath the surface of stability, subtle tensions existed. George Sodder was outspoken, particularly about politics. Having lived under authoritarian rule in Italy, he held strong opinions about freedom and power. He openly criticized Benito Mussolini and the fascist regime that had dominated his homeland. These views were not universally welcomed, even after the war ended. In a town with many Italian immigrants, some with complicated relationships to the old country, George's willingness to speak openly made him memorable, occasionally controversial. Disagreements rarely escalated, but words have a way of lingering longer than intended. Still, within the Sodder home, politics remained secondary. What mattered most was family. The children grew up bonded by shared space and shared responsibility. They celebrated holidays together. They fought and reconciled like siblings everywhere. They learned early how to look out for one another. Christmas, in particular, held special meaning. The Sodders did not celebrate with extravagance. Their gifts were modest, chosen with care rather than abundance. What made the holiday special was togetherness, the rare pause in routine, the permission to stay up late, the excitement that lived in anticipation rather than excess. By December 1945, the world felt cautiously hopeful. The Second World War had ended just months earlier. Soldiers were returning home, rationing was easing. Families across the country were beginning to imagine futures that extended beyond survival. For the Sodders, this sense of relief was deeply felt. George's business was steady, the family was secure, the children were healthy. The house on the hill represented not just shelter, but success, evidence that their immigrant journey had led somewhere meaningful. They believed they had earned this peace. That belief would soon become unbearable. Because tragedy does not always target families already fractured or vulnerable. Sometimes it strikes those who have done everything right, those who believed effort could guarantee safety. On the evening of December 24, 1945, the Sodder household reflected that belief completely. There were no arguments, no threats, no sense of danger. The children laughed, the parents relaxed. Christmas morning felt close enough to touch. Jennie allowed 5 of the children to stay up later than usual, a small indulgence, harmless and joyful. It was Christmas Eve, after all. The house buzzed softly with excitement before settling into sleep. Nothing about the night suggested loss. Nothing hinted that this family, known for its warmth and stability, would soon be defined by absence. The Sodders went to sleep believing in the future. They could not know that the structure they trusted would betray them. They could not know that systems meant to protect them would fail. They could not know that by morning their family would be permanently altered, not just by death, but by uncertainty. What followed would transform them from a respected local family into reluctant guardians of one of America's most haunting mysteries. Because when the fire came, it did more than destroy a house.
It erased certainty, and it forced the Sodders into a role they never wanted, seekers of truth in a world that would offer them very little of it. Before the fire, they were a family building the American dream. After the fire, they would spend the rest of their lives chasing something far more elusive: answers.
The final hours before disaster did not feel extraordinary. That is what made them so haunting. December 24th, 1945, unfolded for the Sodder family exactly as Christmas Eve always had: steady, familiar, and unremarkable in the best possible way. There was no sense of urgency, no shadow hanging over the house, no moment that would later stand out as a warning. The night carried only routine and quiet anticipation. Fayetteville settled into winter darkness early. Cold air drifted down from the hills, brushing against the wooden houses scattered along the road. Inside the Sodder home, warmth held firm. The stove had done its work. Coats were hung. Shoes were lined up neatly near the door. The smell of dinner lingered faintly, mixing with the scent of pine and winter clothing. The children were restless in the way only children can be on Christmas Eve. Laughter rose and fell from room to room. Footsteps moved across the wooden floors. Small arguments flared and faded just as quickly. Christmas morning felt close enough to taste. For them, time slowed, stretched by excitement. George and Jennie watched their children with tired satisfaction. This was the reward of years spent working, saving, and sacrificing. A house full of life, a future that seemed stable, and a holiday free from fear. The war was over. The world felt safer than it had in years. There was no reason to rush the night. Jennie made a decision that would later echo endlessly in her mind. She allowed 5 of the children to stay up later than usual. It was a harmless exception, one granted out of affection rather than necessity. Christmas Eve, after all, came only once a year. The children retreated upstairs, gathering in the bedroom that several of them shared. Their voices drifted down faintly, softened by distance and walls. Quiet games, whispered jokes, the low murmur of siblings enjoying a rare moment of freedom. Downstairs, George and Jennie began their own routine. Doors were checked. The house was secured as it always was. Lights remained on longer than usual, casting soft glows into empty rooms. Eventually, even those lights were dimmed. The house settled. The creaks and sighs of cooling wood filled the silence. The building adjusted to the cold outside. Breathing slowed. Dreams began. Nothing about the house suggested danger. Sometime after midnight, the phone rang. The sound cut sharply through the quiet, startling Jennie awake. The ring felt intrusive, out of place in a house that had already surrendered to sleep. She reached for the receiver, her mind still fogged by rest. On the other end of the line was a woman's voice. The caller asked for someone Jennie did not recognize. The name meant nothing to her. Jennie explained that the caller had reached the wrong number. Then came laughter. It was not brief or apologetic. It lingered longer than expected, followed by silence as the line went dead. No explanation, no goodbye. Jennie sat for a moment, unsettled. Wrong numbers were not unusual, but something about the tone felt off, unfamiliar, intrusive. Still half asleep, she placed the receiver back on its cradle and tried to dismiss the feeling. She lay back down. Minutes passed. Then came another disturbance. A loud thump struck the roof, sudden, heavy, unmistakable. Jennie sat upright again, heart racing. She listened carefully, straining to understand what she had heard. Something rolled across the roof before silence returned. There were no voices outside, no footsteps, no further sounds. She considered waking George. Then she hesitated. Perhaps it was ice sliding free. Perhaps a branch had broken loose. Winter nights were unpredictable, and there was no immediate reason to assume danger. Reluctantly, she tried to rest again. The lights downstairs were still on. This detail would later become significant.
At the time, it felt ordinary, nothing more than a house not yet fully surrendered to darkness. But memory has a way of rearranging itself after tragedy, and small details take on new weight. Upstairs, the children slept. The hours that followed passed quietly. No one cried out, no movement disturbed the stillness. The house existed in that fragile calm that only exists when people believe they are safe. But beneath that calm, systems were already failing. The phone that rang earlier would soon be useless. The lines that connected the family to help would not work. The night was slipping away minute by minute, carrying with it the last moments of normal life the Sodders would ever know. In the early morning hours, Jennie awoke again. This time, something was wrong. The air felt thick, heavy, unnatural. Her throat burned, her eyes stung. She coughed involuntarily, her body reacting before her mind fully understood. The smell of smoke filled the room. Confusion evaporated instantly, replaced by terror. She called out to George. He was awake immediately. There was no time for questions, no time to understand how or why. The fire had already taken hold. From this moment forward, the night shattered. But it was the earlier hours, the quiet ones, that would later become the most disturbing. The strange phone call, the unexplained impact on the roof, the children awake later than usual, the lights still on. And when Jennie tried to call for help, the phone did not work. She lifted the receiver. Nothing. She tried again. Silence. Repeated attempts failed. There was no operator, no connection, no response. The line was dead. At the time, panic overwhelmed reason. There was no space to analyze why. Survival replaced understanding. Escape became the only instinct. But later, this detail would haunt the family relentlessly, because investigations would reveal that the phone lines were not destroyed by fire. They had been cut. The damage occurred before the flames could have reached them. Communication was severed deliberately. As George and Jennie fled the house, shouting for their children, the fire intensified with terrifying speed. Flames raced upward, blocking access to the stairs. Smoke thickened, reducing visibility to almost nothing. 2 children escaped through a window. 5 did not. The final moments before the house became unreachable were chaos, but the hours before the fire were not. They were orderly, calm, predictable, and that is what made the night of December 24th so difficult to accept. There was no warning, no escalation, no sense of threat, just a sequence of ordinary moments interrupted by a handful of strange details that only gained meaning later. Investigators would eventually piece together timelines. Witnesses would come forward, statements would be made and dismissed, but nothing would ever fully explain what happened during those quiet hours between bedtime and fire. The Sodders would replay the night endlessly. Jennie would question herself for answering the phone, for not waking George after the sound on the roof, for letting the children stay up. George would question why the systems he relied on failed simultaneously, why help could not be reached, why nothing worked when it mattered most. But guilt does not equal responsibility, and hindsight does not create cause. The truth is simpler and more disturbing. The night of December 24th did not feel like the beginning of a mystery. It felt like tradition, like safety, like home. Only later would it be understood as the final stretch of ordinary life for the Sodder family, the last hours before certainty collapsed into questions, before memory became evidence, before 5 children were last known to be alive. They went to sleep believing in Christmas morning. They did not know the night had already turned against them. The fire would soon make itself known. But the mystery began long before the flames. It began in silence, in a phone call that did not belong, in a sound on the roof with no explanation, in a house that trusted the dark one last time. And when morning came, December 24th would no longer be remembered as Christmas Eve. It would be remembered as the final night the Sodder children were last known to be alive.
The fire did not wait for understanding. It moved with a speed that allowed no time for questions, only reaction. By the moment the Sodder family fully understood what was happening, the house they trusted had already turned against them. When Jennie Sodder realized the smell filling the room was smoke, instinct took over. She moved through darkness thickened by heat, coughing as she called out for her children. Panic erased the boundaries of rooms and floors. Everything became urgency. George was awake instantly. He did not ask how the fire started or where it was coming from. He did not pause to think. He ran. Flames were already climbing the structure, feeding on the dry wood of the house. Smoke poured into hallways, blinding and choking. The stairway to the upper floor was quickly blocked by fire, turning the primary path to the children's bedrooms into a wall of heat. The house, built to shelter, became a trap. 2 of the children managed to escape through a downstairs window. They fell into the yard below, landing hard in the cold winter grass. Fear carried them forward as they ran away from the flames. Their survival depended on seconds, a narrow opening of time that closed almost immediately afterward. George and Jennie escaped as well, stumbling barefoot into the freezing night. The cold cut sharply against skin still burning from heat. Behind them, the house roared. But 5 children were still inside. Their bedrooms were on the upper floor, directly in the path of the fire. Smoke rose rapidly, filling those rooms before flames arrived. Whether the children woke, became disoriented, or were overcome while still asleep is unknown. No cries were heard, no movement was seen. George turned back toward the house without hesitation. He ran to retrieve the ladder he always kept leaned against the side of the building. It was essential. With it, he could reach the upstairs windows. Without it, there was no path. The ladder was gone. Not broken, not burned. Gone. In disbelief, George ran along the side of the house, scanning the ground, calling out, searching through the darkness. The ladder was nowhere to be found. Later daylight would confirm what panic could not explain. It had been moved far from its usual place. At that moment, there was no time to question how or why. George ran to his trucks. He owned a coal truck that he used daily for work. If he could drive it close enough to the house, he could climb onto the roof or break through a window. He jumped inside, turning the ignition. The engine did not respond. He tried again. Nothing. Both trucks failed to start. This had never happened before. George tried again and again, growing more frantic with each attempt. The trucks remained silent, useless in the moment they were needed most. Only later would they start without issue. As George struggled, neighbors began to appear, drawn by the glow on the hillside. The fire was visible from Route 16 below, lighting the sky with a pulsing orange that cut through the darkness. Shouts echoed through the night. Buckets of water were passed hand to hand, thrown uselessly against flames already too large to fight. People shouted for the children. Windows shattered from heat and impact. No one could reach the upper floor. The fire intensified rapidly, climbing through the structure as if guided. Flames burst through windows. The roof began to glow. Heat radiated outward, forcing everyone back. Calls for help were attempted. The phone did not work. The line was dead. Neighbors tried from their own houses. Still nothing. The volunteer fire department was small and poorly equipped. Communication systems were limited. Confusion spread as attempts were made to alert firefighters. Time passed. No sirens were heard. Minutes stretched into hours. The house burned from the inside out. Floors collapsed one by one. Walls fell inward. The roof caved in, sending sparks and embers into the sky.
The sound of the fire dominated everything, a roar that drowned out voices and hope alike. George and Jennie stood helpless in the yard, shouting their children's names into a structure that no longer resembled a home. There was no path inside, no way through. The fire had decided the outcome. Neighbors later described the scene as unbearable, a family watching their home collapse, parents screaming into flames, children crying in the cold, and no help arriving. By the time firefighters finally reached the scene, the fire had already consumed itself. Dawn was approaching, pale and reluctant, as if uncertain whether it should rise at all. There was nothing left to extinguish. The house was gone. What remained was a smoking foundation, charred beams, twisted metal bed frames marking where bedrooms once stood. The ground was still warm beneath the cold winter air. Steam rose quietly from the ruins. The firefighters moved through the debris, surveying what little remained. There were no active flames, no lives to save. The opportunity for rescue had passed long before their arrival. For the Sodder family, the absence of help during the night would become one of the most painful memories of all, because in the hours when something might still have been done, no one came. As Christmas morning broke, reality settled in with brutal clarity. 5 children were missing. They were assumed to have died in the fire, but there was no confirmation, no bodies, no remains, only ashes and silence. The Sodders did not leave the site. They stood where their home had been, staring at the ruins, unable to accept what they were being told. Shock held grief at a distance. The magnitude of the loss was too large to process all at once. The fire chief arrived and surveyed the scene. Initial explanations formed quickly. The blaze had been intense, the structure was wooden, the children were upstairs. The implication was clear. But for the Sodders, it was not enough. They had watched the fire consume the house, they had seen what remained, and they had not seen what should have been there. As the morning progressed, the town began to wake. Christmas morning arrived quietly, stripped of celebration. News spread slowly, carried by word of mouth rather than headlines. Neighbors gathered at a distance, unsure how to approach a family standing amid devastation. There was no celebration, no relief, only a question that hung heavily in the cold air. Where were the children? The fire had taken everything, the house, possessions, memories built over years. But what it had not taken was certainty, because the fire ended, and the silence that followed was louder than the flames ever were. By the end of that morning, the Sodders understood something that would shape the rest of their lives. This was not simply a tragedy. It was the beginning of a mystery. A fire had erased their home, but it had not explained the absence left behind. And as the smoke lifted over Fayetteville, the Sodders stood in the ashes of certainty, realizing that what burned that night might not have been the end of their children's story.
When the fire finally died, it did not leave peace behind. It left confusion. As dawn spread slowly across the hills of Fayetteville, the Sodder family stood in the cold, staring at what had once been their home. Smoke drifted upward in thin, restless columns. The ground beneath their feet was still warm in places, as if the earth itself had not yet accepted what had happened. Christmas morning had arrived, but there were no gifts, no celebration, only ash. For George and Jennie Sodder, the hours immediately following the fire passed in a haze of shock and disbelief. Grief had not yet fully arrived. Instead, there was a mechanical urgency, a need to do something, anything, before the night's horror became final. They did not wait for permission. They moved toward the ruins. George stepped into the debris first, pushing aside blackened boards and broken bricks with his hands. Jennie followed, her eyes scanning the wreckage where bedrooms had once been. They knew the layout of the house intimately. They knew exactly where each child slept. That knowledge guided every movement. They were searching for remains. They expected to find them, because as devastating as death is, it leaves evidence. Hour after hour, the search continued. Neighbors joined quietly, offering help without words. Shovels were brought, rakes, anything that could move debris aside. People worked carefully, respectfully, bracing themselves for what they believed they would inevitably uncover. But nothing appeared. Ash was sifted, charred beams were lifted, metal bed frames emerged, twisted but recognizable, marking where beds once stood. Still, nothing. No bones, no fragments, no teeth. The absence began to feel unnatural. Even amid total destruction, some things had survived. Household objects remained identifiable. Metal springs, despite exposure to extreme heat, were clearly visible. Dishes, tools, and pieces of furniture appeared damaged but not erased. Yet the children were gone. At first, the family told themselves they simply had not searched deeply enough. Perhaps the remains were buried beneath collapsed floors. Perhaps they had been pushed into spaces not yet reached. So they dug deeper. The search expanded to the foundation. Ash and soil were removed layer by layer. The area beneath where the upstairs bedrooms had collapsed received particular attention. This was where the children should have been. Still, nothing. As the hours turned into days, the disbelief hardened into alarm. George Sodder was not unfamiliar with fire or destruction. He had worked around heavy equipment, engines, and industrial heat. He understood that fire damages, but he also understood that it does not make people vanish. That belief was reinforced when others began to weigh in. A local crematorium operator spoke with George and offered a sobering perspective. In professional cremations, he explained, temperatures are far higher and far more controlled than in any residential fire. Even then, bones remain. They must be mechanically processed after cremation. A house fire, no matter how intense, could not completely destroy 5 human bodies without leaving a trace. The words settled heavily, because they confirmed what instinct already knew. This was not normal. Authorities arrived and observed the search. Their position was firm. The fire, they said, had burned hot and long. The children must have been completely consumed. The explanation was delivered as fact, but it was not supported by evidence. When George questioned the lack of remains, the response was dismissive. He was told that extreme heat explained everything, that further searching was unnecessary, that dwelling on the site would only deepen the family's pain. To George and Jennie, this felt backwards. They were not asking to prolong grief, they were asking for proof. The investigation did not expand. No forensic specialists were brought in. No systematic excavation was ordered. Instead, decisions were made that would later haunt the case permanently. Within days, the foundation of the house was bulldozed. Dirt was pushed over the site, effectively burying whatever evidence might still have been present beneath layers of soil. This action was explained as a kindness, a way to help the family move forward, to give them a clean place to rebuild. But for the Sodders, it felt like erasure. The one place where answers might still have existed was sealed off forever. Evidence was buried before it was properly examined. Any chance of discovering remains or confirming their absence was eliminated. Death certificates were prepared shortly afterward. The cause of death for the 5 children was listed as fire. No remains were required. No forensic confirmation was attached. On paper, the tragedy was resolved. In reality, it had only begun. The family was now faced with an impossible situation. Their children were officially declared dead, yet there was no physical proof to support that conclusion. No remains to bury, no graves to visit, no finality to anchor grief. This absence altered the nature of their mourning. Without bodies, there could be no closure.
Without evidence, there could be no acceptance. Jennie, in particular, struggled with the void. A mother's grief seeks something tangible, a place, an object, a ritual. She was given none of these. Instead, she was asked to accept a conclusion that contradicted everything she had seen with her own eyes. As days passed, whispers began to circulate. Some neighbors quietly admitted that the lack of remains troubled them as well. Others accepted the official explanation, eager to move on from a tragedy that made them uncomfortable. But the Sodders could not move on. They returned to the site repeatedly, standing over the buried foundation, imagining what might still lie beneath. Every visit reinforced the same question. If the children died in the fire, where were they? The search for remains became the moment when the Sodder case transformed. Up until then, it was a tragedy. Afterward, it became a mystery. Because absence is no neutral. Absence demands explanation, and the explanations offered did not hold. George began documenting everything. He wrote down what was found and what was not. He recorded conversations, dates, and statements. The lack of remains became the cornerstone of his doubt, the detail he would return to again and again. Experts he consulted later would consistently agree with him. The fire could not have destroyed all evidence of 5 bodies, not in a residential structure, not without accelerants, not without leaving something behind. That knowledge hardened George's resolve. The search for remains had not ended with discovery, it had ended with a realization. The fire scene did not support the official story, and if the children were not in the ashes, then the fire was not the end of their story. It may have been the beginning of something far worse. For the Sodders, the ground beneath their feet no longer felt solid, not just because the house was gone, but because certainty had collapsed with it. They were left standing in a space where answers should have been, staring into a silence that refused to explain itself. 5 children were missing, not confirmed dead, not located, just gone. And the longer the search continued without results, the clearer one terrifying possibility became. The fire had not taken the children, the fire had hidden them. And somewhere beyond the ashes, the truth waited, buried not by flames, but by decisions made too quickly, questions not asked, and evidence never allowed to speak. The search for remains failed, but in that failure, it revealed something far more disturbing. The Sodder children did not leave their story behind in the fire. They took it with them. And the family would spend the rest of their lives trying to bring it back.
In the days following the fire, the world around the Sodder family began to move with unsettling speed. While George and Jennie were still standing in ashes, still searching for something, anything that might explain the disappearance of their children, decisions were already being made on their behalf. Conclusions were forming not from evidence, but from convenience. What should have been the beginning of a careful investigation became instead a swift effort to close a case that had barely been examined. Authorities declared the tragedy an accident. The fire, they said, had been devastating. The children, they said, had perished inside. The lack of remains, they said, was unfortunate but explainable. And just like that, certainty was imposed. Death certificates were issued within days, listing fire as the cause of death for the 5 missing children. No bodies were required. No forensic confirmation was demanded. No explanation was offered for how 5 human bodies could vanish completely in a residential fire. The paperwork carried authority. The questions did not. For George and Jennie Sodder, this moment marked a second loss. The first had been their children. The second was truth. They objected immediately. George questioned the conclusions openly, asking how such certainty could exist without physical proof. He asked why no bones, no teeth, no fragments had been recovered. He asked why experts had not been consulted.
He asked why the site had been altered before a thorough investigation could be completed. The answers he received were vague. The fire was hot. The fire burned for hours. Nothing could have survived. These statements were delivered confidently, but without documentation, without testing, and without scientific support. They were explanations offered to end a discussion, not to resolve it. The fire chief's report became central to the official narrative. The cause of the fire was initially attributed to faulty wiring. This conclusion was accepted without challenge, despite George's insistence that the electrical system had been inspected recently and found to be in good condition. No electrical analysis was conducted. No wiring was tested. No independent fire investigators were consulted. The explanation stood because it was easy, and ease, in this case, replaced accuracy. Perhaps most troubling was what happened to the fire scene itself. Instead of being preserved as a potential crime site, the ruins were disturbed almost immediately. Neighbors, officials, and workers moved freely through the debris. Objects were shifted. Ashes were scattered. Any opportunity for controlled forensic examination faded with every passing hour. Then came the decision that would permanently shape the case. The foundation of the house was bulldozed. Dirt was pushed over the remains, burying whatever evidence might still have existed beneath the ground. This action was framed as compassionate, a way to help the family rebuild, to give them closure. But for the Sodders, it felt like something else entirely. It felt like erasure. By covering the site, authorities eliminated the last physical space where answers might still be found. If bones had been missed, if evidence had been overlooked, if remains had been buried beneath collapsed floors, none of it could ever be verified. The ground was sealed. So were the questions. George protested. He asked for further excavation. He asked for professional examination. He asked for time. He was denied. The case, officials insisted, was over. What troubled the Sodders most was not just the conclusion itself, but the refusal to revisit it. Every inconsistency was dismissed. Every objection was treated as emotional resistance rather than rational concern. Grief, they were told, makes people imagine things. Shock, they were told, distorts memory. But what the Sodders were pointing to was not imagination. It was absence. And absence is not subjective. No remains had been found. That fact did not change. As days turned into weeks, the distance between the family and authorities grew wider. Conversations became strained. Requests went unanswered. Doors quietly closed. The message was clear. Acceptance was expected. Silence was preferred. George refused both. He began speaking to anyone who would listen. Firefighters from other towns, crematorium workers, medical professionals, engineers. Again and again he heard the same conclusion. Residential fires do not erase human bodies completely. Even extreme heat leaves something behind. Teeth endure. Bones calcify. The official explanation was not just weak, it was implausible. One detail in particular would later expose the fragility of the official conclusions. During the early examination of the site, an object described as a heart was reportedly found among the debris. This discovery was used to support the claim that at least one body had been present in the fire. It was cited quietly, without public scrutiny, as confirmation of death. George did not accept it. He arranged for the object to be examined by a pathologist. The result was devastating. The tissue was not human. It belonged to an animal. This meant the only biological evidence used to justify the death certificates was false. Yet nothing changed. The official ruling was not amended. The case remained closed. For the Sodders, this was the moment when doubt transformed into certainty. Not certainty of what had happened, certainty that the official story could not be trusted. The early conclusions were not built on investigation, they were built on assumption, and assumption had replaced responsibility. The family began to understand something deeply unsettling. The system designed to find truth was not interested in continuing the search. Whether out of limited resources, embarrassment, or simple desire to move on, the result was the same. Questions were being buried alongside evidence. This realization reshaped the Sodders' grief. They were no longer just mourning parents, they were challengers of an official narrative that demanded belief without proof. Every time George raised his concerns, he was met with the same resistance. The case is closed. The children died in the fire. There was nothing more to investigate. But the Sodders knew something essential. A closed case does not equal a solved one, and silence does not equal truth. As time passed, the early official conclusions hardened into accepted history. Newspapers repeated the same explanation. Public memory simplified the story. The fire became an accident. The children became casualties. The contradictions faded from view, except for the family. For George and Jennie, those early conclusions became the fuel that kept the search alive. The refusal to investigate properly convinced them that answers would not be handed to them. They would have to be found. The early conclusions meant to end the story, instead marked its transformation. What began as tragedy became resistance. What began as loss became pursuit. Because when certainty is delivered too quickly, it often hides what lies beneath. And in the case of the Sodder children, the speed of the conclusion felt like another kind of fire, one that consumed truth before it could be examined, leaving behind not closure, but doubt. The authorities closed the case. The Sodders did not. And from that point forward, the search for answers would no longer rely on official permission. It would rely on persistence, on memory, on the refusal to accept that 5 children could disappear into paperwork without explanation. The early conclusions failed to bring peace. They ignited something else entirely. A lifelong investigation and a mystery that would refuse to die.
Once the authorities closed the case, they expected the questions to stop. They did not. For George and Jennie Sodder, the official conclusion did not end their grief, it sharpened it. With no remains to bury and no answers to accept, their minds returned again and again to the same realization. Too many things had gone wrong that night, and they had gone wrong in ways that felt deliberate. At first, the details surfaced quietly, one by one. Each seemed small in isolation. Together, they formed a pattern that could not be ignored. The first was the ladder. George Sodder had always kept a long ladder leaned against the side of the house. It was used regularly, for maintenance, cleaning gutters, reaching the upstairs windows. Its location was fixed, familiar, unquestioned. On the night of the fire, when George desperately needed it to reach his trapped children, it was gone. Not damaged, not partially burned, gone entirely. In the chaos of the fire, George searched the perimeter of the house, expecting to find the ladder knocked over or displaced by heat. It was nowhere. In the daylight hours that followed, the truth became undeniable. The ladder was later found far from the house, deliberately placed at the bottom of an embankment. No explanation was ever given. No neighbor admitted moving it. Authorities suggested it may have been displaced earlier or moved accidentally. George knew better. The ladder had been there the day before. It had not fallen. It had not been borrowed. Someone had removed it. The second failure came moments later. When the ladder could not be found, George ran to his coal truck, the same truck he drove daily, the same truck that had never failed him before. His plan was simple: drive it close enough to the house, climb onto the roof, and reach the upstairs windows. The engine would not start. He tried again. Nothing. Both trucks failed. This was not a mechanical issue that lingered. After the fire, the trucks worked normally. No repairs were required, no faults were found. The failure existed only in the moment when rescue depended on them. Authorities dismissed this as coincidence, cold weather, stress, panic. But coincidence does not explain timing. The truck failed at the exact moment it was needed, and only then. Then there were the phone lines. Jennie's strange midnight phone call had already unsettled her, but when the fire began and neighbors tried to call for help, the phone line was dead. At first, it was assumed the fire had damaged it. That assumption collapsed under scrutiny. Investigators later discovered that the phone lines had been cut, not burned through, not melted, but severed, cleanly, intentionally. The cut occurred at a location where fire damage could not explain it. Someone had disabled the family's ability to call for help. This detail alone should have transformed the investigation. It did not. Officials suggested the damage might have occurred accidentally, falling debris, heat exposure, but the physical evidence contradicted those explanations. The line had been cut before the fire reached it. Communication was removed deliberately. Then came the witness statements. At first, they emerged hesitantly. Neighbors were unsure whether to speak. Some assumed their memories were distorted by shock. Others feared contradicting the official narrative. But as the days passed, people began to come forward. One witness reported seeing a car parked near the Sodder home on the night of the fire. Unfamiliar, lingering longer than expected. The vehicle was there before flames were visible. Later, the same witness saw it speeding away. Another neighbor claimed to have seen individuals throwing objects described as fireballs onto the roof of the house. These statements were recorded and then quietly dismissed. Authorities did not pursue them aggressively. No suspects were identified. No follow-up interviews were conducted. The possibility of arson was not seriously explored. More unsettling were the sightings reported after the fire. A woman claimed she saw children matching the Sodders' descriptions eating breakfast at a roadside diner the morning after the fire. The children were accompanied by adults who appeared controlling and unwilling to let them speak freely. The woman remembered the scene because it felt strange. Only later did she connect it to the missing children. Another report came from a witness who believed they saw children resembling the Sodders traveling towards Charleston, West Virginia, accompanied by unfamiliar adults. A hotel employee later reported seeing children who matched their descriptions staying briefly at her establishment. The adults with them seemed anxious, avoiding conversation. Individually, these sightings could be dismissed. Collectively, they formed a troubling thread. If the children had died in the fire, how could so many independent witnesses claim to have seen them alive afterwards? Authorities dismissed the reports as mistaken identity, grief-driven confusion, coincidence. No formal investigations followed. No composite sketches were created. No travel routes were analyzed. The possibility that the children had been removed from the house alive was never seriously considered. Even physical evidence raised concerns. During early examinations of the fire site, an object described as a heart was reported found among the debris. This discovery was used quietly to support the conclusion that at least one body had been present. George demanded verification. He arranged for the object to be examined by a pathologist. The result was devastating. The tissue was not human. It belonged to an animal. This meant the only biological evidence used to justify the official ruling was false. Still, the death certificates remained unchanged. The case stayed closed. As the Sodders revisited these details, a pattern emerged that was impossible to ignore. The ladder, removed. The truck, disabled. The phone lines, cut. Witnesses, ignored. False evidence, accepted. Evidence, buried. None of these elements aligned with a simple accident. Together, they suggested interference. Not chaos, not coincidence. Intervention. The Sodders began documenting everything meticulously. Dates, names, statements, locations. What had once been memory became record. What had once been grief became investigation. George understood something crucial. If the fire had been accidental, the failures surrounding it would not align so precisely. If the children had died inside, something would have been left behind. If the case were truly closed, it would not resist examination so forcefully. The evidence did not add up, and the Sodders knew it.
From that moment forward, the family understood that the truth would not be given to them. It would have to be uncovered, slowly, painfully, against resistance. The fire had ended. The real investigation was only beginning.
After the fire was officially declared an accident and the case quietly closed, the Sodders found themselves standing in a void where answers should have been, surrounded by a silence that felt deliberate rather than natural. Grief alone might have broken another family, but uncertainty hardened theirs. George and Jennie Sodder understood something instinctively and painfully clear. If they accepted the official explanation, their children would vanish not only from the house on the hill, but from history itself. And so, without badges, authority, or support, they became investigators, not because they wanted to, but because no one else would. George approached the task with the same methodical determination that had built his business and sustained his family for decades. He began by reconstructing the night in obsessive detail, replaying every minute repeatedly in his mind, mapping failures and anomalies until they no longer felt random. The missing ladder, the disabled trucks, the dead phone line, the delayed fire response, each detail alone could be dismissed, but together they formed a chain that felt intentional. George began writing letters to fire experts, engineers, and crematorium operators across the country, asking not emotional questions, but technical ones. Could a residential fire burn hot enough to destroy 5 human bodies completely? Could teeth disappear? Could bones turn entirely to ash? The replies he received were consistent and damning. Even in controlled cremations, experts explained, bone fragments remain. Teeth almost always survive. A wooden house fire, no matter how intense, could not erase all physical traces of 5 children. These responses did not bring comfort, they brought resolve. If the children were not in the ashes, then the fire had not taken them. That realization reshaped everything. George began documenting evidence with precision, turning memory into record. He wrote down dates, times, witness names, expert opinions. He collected statements that had been ignored or dismissed, including accounts of unfamiliar cars near the house, strange behavior in the days leading up to Christmas, and reports of objects being thrown onto the roof. He kept copies of letters, reports, and photographs, building an archive that grew heavier with each unanswered question. Jennie, meanwhile, became the keeper of hope, though it was a role that extracted a brutal emotional toll. She treated every reported sighting as potentially real, every letter from a stranger as a possible thread leading back to her children. She saved envelopes, wrote down phone calls, and replayed conversations endlessly, searching for patterns or overlooked details. While George chased facts, Jennie chased possibilities. Together, they formed a grim partnership, logic and love bound by loss. The Sodders spent money they could scarcely afford to hire private investigators, men unconnected to Fayetteville and unburdened by local pressure. These investigators re-interviewed witnesses who had grown uneasy with the official story, people who admitted they had held back out of fear or loyalty. Some described seeing unfamiliar figures on the property before the fire. Others recalled hearing strange noises or seeing lights where none should have been. One investigator confirmed what George already suspected. The phone lines had been cut deliberately, not damaged by heat. Another examined the fire response timeline and found delays that had never been adequately explained. As the private investigation deepened, George revisited events from months before the fire that now felt sinister. A life insurance salesman had visited the Sodder home and reacted angrily when George refused to buy a policy. The man warned that George's house would burn and his children would be destroyed because of his political beliefs. At the time, it sounded like an empty threat. After the fire, it felt like prophecy. George had been outspoken in his criticism of Mussolini and fascism, even after the war ended. In a community with complex loyalties and lingering resentments, his views may have been a target. Investigators noted the threat carefully, recognizing it as potential motive rather than coincidence. Then there was the object George found in the yard, a dark, rubber-like item resembling a wartime incendiary device. Such devices were known to ignite fires silently and effectively. George turned it over to investigators, but authorities showed little interest. To the Sodders, this indifference was as disturbing as the object itself. It suggested not just oversight, but reluctance. The family reached beyond local officials, writing to state authorities and eventually the FBI. The Bureau reviewed the case and acknowledged irregularities, but declined long-term involvement, citing jurisdictional limits. Even so, that acknowledgement mattered. It confirmed that the Sodders' doubts were not delusions born of grief. Something about the case did not sit right. As years passed, the private investigation became more disciplined, almost institutional. Files were organized, photographs were labeled, witness statements were cross-referenced. The Sodders transformed their home into an unofficial archive of the disappearance. George traveled whenever leads surfaced, sometimes crossing state lines based on nothing more than a letter or rumor. Most journeys ended in disappointment, but a few returned with new fragments, sightings, testimonies, unanswered questions. Jennie endured the cycle of hope and collapse repeatedly, each time believing this lead might be the one, each time absorbing the pain when it wasn't. Their search isolated them. Friends grew uncomfortable with the constant presence of tragedy. Conversations narrowed. Holidays became unbearable. Christmas, especially, transformed from celebration into ritualized grief. Jennie wore black for the rest of her life, a visible declaration that mourning had not ended because nothing had been resolved. Critics accused the Sodders of obsession, of refusing to let go. But letting go requires something to release, a body, a grave, a truth. The Sodders had none. Their private investigation did not produce definitive proof of kidnapping or survival, but it achieved something equally important. It dismantled the illusion of certainty. It exposed how quickly assumptions had replaced inquiry, how easily evidence had been buried, literally and figuratively, and how the absence of proof had been treated as proof itself. The Sodders learned firsthand how institutions resist reconsideration, how uncomfortable questions are smoothed over rather than answered, especially when time passes and accountability fades. Their investigation ensured that the case could not be neatly sealed as an accident. It preserved contradictions that refused to disappear. It kept the story alive when official channels would have allowed it to die quietly. Most importantly, it transformed the narrative. The Sodder children were not just victims of a fire, they were missing persons in a case that had never been properly resolved. George and Jennie understood they might not see justice or answers in their lifetime, but they also understood that surrendering to silence would erase their children completely. Their private investigation became an act of resistance against forgetting, a refusal to allow 5 lives to dissolve into paperwork and assumptions. In the absence of truth, they created permanence, records, questions, and doubt that would outlive them. And long after their voices fell silent, that doubt would remain, insisting that the disappearance of the Sodder children was not an accident neatly explained, but a mystery demanding remembrance, persistence, and the courage to keep asking what others had chosen to stop asking.
After the fire was buried beneath dirt and paperwork, the Sodders were left with a reality that felt impossible to live inside. 5 children officially declared dead, yet no proof of death anywhere in the world. In that vacuum, something unexpected began to happen. The silence started to break, not with answers, but with voices. Reports surfaced slowly at first, tentative and uncertain, as if people were afraid to speak. Then they came more frequently, arriving from places far beyond Fayetteville. These were not confessions or discoveries of remains. They were sightings,
ordinary moments described by ordinary people who believed they had seen children who should not exist. For George and Jennie, these accounts were both torment and oxygen. Each one reopened wounds, each one also kept hope alive. Without bodies, the possibility that the children had survived the fire could not be dismissed, and these sightings became the most emotionally charged aspect of the entire case. The earliest report came from a woman working at a roadside restaurant in West Virginia. She claimed that on the morning after the fire, Christmas Day, she served breakfast to a group of children whose descriptions closely matched those of the missing Sodders. The children were accompanied by adults who appeared tense and controlling. According to the woman, the adults discouraged conversation and watched the children closely, as if afraid of what they might say. At the time, the encounter did not seem significant. Only later, when she saw newspaper photographs of the missing children, did the memory return with force. The timing disturbed the Sodders deeply. If the children had truly died in the fire during the night, how could they have been eating breakfast the next morning miles away? Authorities dismissed the account as mistaken identity, but no formal follow-up investigation was conducted. No attempt was made to verify travel routes, restaurant records, or staff recollections. The report was quietly filed away. More sightings followed. Another witness claimed to have seen children resembling the Sodders traveling in a vehicle heading toward Charleston, West Virginia. The children were described as quiet and guarded, accompanied by adults who appeared anxious and unwilling to engage. The witness remembered the encounter specifically because of the children's demeanor. It felt unnatural, restrained, as if they had been instructed not to speak. Again, the account was dismissed. Officials argued that America was full of displaced families in the post-war period, that resemblance did not equal identity. But the Sodders were not convinced. They noted that these reports shared common details: similar ages, similar appearances, controlling adults, and a sense of urgency or secrecy. As time passed, sightings expanded beyond West Virginia. Reports arrived from the southeastern United States, particularly Florida. One woman contacted the Sodders claiming she had seen children matching their descriptions staying at a tourist court. She recalled that the children appeared nervous and closely supervised, rarely speaking to outsiders. The adults with them seemed alert, watchful, and unwilling to answer questions. The woman stated that she remembered the incident clearly because it felt unsettling even then. George followed the lead, traveling when possible, showing photographs, asking questions. Nothing definitive emerged, but nothing disproved the account either. The trail simply went cold, as so many others would. In Texas, another report surfaced from a hotel employee who believed she had seen children resembling the Sodders staying briefly at the establishment. Once again, the description aligned closely enough to raise alarm: dark hair, similar facial features, ages consistent with the missing children if they had survived. The employee remembered the group because of the adults' behavior, unusually strict, unwilling to let the children out of sight. The attempts to follow up, but records were incomplete and memories faded quickly. By the time questions were asked, the opportunity for verification had passed. For outsiders, these sightings appeared unreliable, even inevitable. In a country still adjusting to life after World War II, millions were traveling, families were displaced, orphaned children were common, lookalikes existed everywhere. Skeptics argued that grief and desperation shaped perception, that people wanted to help and convinced themselves they had seen something meaningful. But for the Sodders, these sightings were not proof, they were possibilities. And in a case defined by absence, possibility mattered. George approached the sightings methodically. He recorded dates, locations, names, and descriptions. He looked for patterns rather than certainty. What troubled him was not just that people claimed to have seen children resembling his own, but that the reports shared behavioral similarities. The children were consistently described as silent, controlled, closely supervised by adults who appeared anxious or evasive. These were not descriptions of carefree families traveling for pleasure. They suggested concealment. Jennie, meanwhile, lived inside the emotional weight of each report. Every sighting forced her to imagine her children alive somewhere, older, frightened, separated, perhaps believing their parents were dead. The idea was unbearable and sustaining at the same time. Hope became a double-edged blade.
Each new account reignited belief, only to leave her devastated when the trail dissolved into nothing. Still, she refused to dismiss any report outright. To do so felt like abandoning her children a second time. As the years passed, the nature of the sightings changed. The children, if alive, would no longer be children. Reports began describing teenagers, then young adults, who bore resemblance to the Sodders. This evolution complicated everything. Time altered faces, memories blurred, certainty became impossible. Yet the reports continued, stretching across decades, refusing to disappear entirely. Authorities remained unmoved. No official task force was created, no national alert system existed at the time to track missing children across state lines. The case remained classified as a tragic accident, and the sightings were treated as emotional byproducts rather than investigative leads. This institutional indifference deepened the Sodders' isolation. They were chasing shadows, while the system insisted there was nothing to chase. What made the sightings especially haunting was that none were conclusively disproven. No witness was proven to be lying. No report was definitively false. Each one simply faded due to lack of evidence, time, or resources. The absence of resolution mirrored the absence of remains. Nothing confirmed survival, but nothing eliminated the possibility either. To the Sodders, this was the most cruel outcome imaginable. If the children had died, grief, however unbearable, might have found an endpoint. But the sightings kept the story open, suspended in uncertainty. Every letter, every phone call, every rumor carried the same question. What if this is the one? What if this is where the trail finally leads home? As the case gained wider attention over the years, the sightings became a central element of its mystery. Journalists revisiting the story focused on them, often portraying them as evidence of kidnapping or survival. Skeptics argued that they represented the dangers of hope unchecked by proof. The truth likely lay somewhere between. The sightings were neither conclusive evidence nor meaningless noise. They were echoes, signals of a story that refused to end cleanly. For the Sodders, the sightings ensured that their children remained present in the world, not just in memory. As long as someone believed they had seen them, the children were not entirely lost. This belief sustained the family through decades of disappointment and loss. It also kept the case alive in public consciousness, preventing it from fading into obscurity. The sightings did not solve the mystery. They complicated it. They challenged the finality of death certificates and official conclusions. They suggested movement where there should have been none, life where there should have been only ashes, and they forced a question that no authority could answer definitively. If the Sodder children truly died in the fire, why did so many people believe they saw them afterwards? And if even one of those sightings was real, what had happened to them after they were taken from the house on the hill? The answers never came, but the sightings left behind something as powerful: doubt. Doubt in the official narrative, doubt in the idea that the story was finished, doubt that allowed the Sodders and later generations to keep asking questions long after others had stopped listening. In the end, the sightings did not offer closure. They offered continuation. They ensured that the disappearance of the Sodder children remained unresolved, not just as a case, but as a human tragedy that refused to be confined to a single night in 1945. As long as people claimed to see what should not exist, the story endured, moving through diners, highways, hotels, and memories, always just out of reach, always asking to be believed.
As the Sodder family followed sightings across states and years, another line of inquiry began to take shape, one that looked backward rather than outward, toward relationships, words, and tensions that existed before the fire. It was not a theory built on spectacle or rumor, but on context, the social and political environment of the time, George Sodder's outspoken views, and a series of encounters that felt increasingly unsettling when viewed through the lens of what came later. This line of inquiry would never produce definitive proof, but it would introduce motive where the official story insisted none was needed. George Sodder was not a quiet man. He did not hide his opinions to preserve comfort. Having grown up in Italy under the rise of fascism, he carried with him a lasting resentment toward authoritarian power. Even after immigrating to the United States and building a stable life in West Virginia, those convictions did not soften. He spoke openly against Benito Mussolini and the fascist regime, criticizing what it had done to Italy and to Italians. In many communities, such views would have been unremarkable after the war. In Fayetteville, a small town with a tight-knit Italian immigrant population, they were more complicated. Italian-American communities in the 1930s and 1940s were not monolithic. Some immigrants had fled fascism, others had complicated loyalties shaped by family ties, fear, or nostalgia. Political disagreements could linger beneath everyday civility. George's willingness to speak bluntly made him visible, memorable, and in some circles unwelcome. None of this suggested violence on its own, but after the fire, the context took on a darker tone. Months before Christmas 1945, a life insurance salesman visited the Sodder home. The visit began routinely enough, but when George declined to purchase a policy, the interaction soured. According to George, the salesman became angry and issued a disturbing warning that George's house would burn and his children would be destroyed because of his political opinions. At the time, George dismissed the remark as bluster, an emotional outburst from a frustrated salesman. After the fire, the words returned with chilling clarity. Threats, especially those remembered after tragedy, are difficult to evaluate. Memory can sharpen or distort, yet the specificity of the warning, fire, children, was impossible for the Sodders to ignore. George documented the encounter and shared it with private investigators. It did not become the basis of an official inquiry, but it remained a fixed point in the family's understanding of what might have preceded the fire. There were other moments that felt newly significant. George recalled strangers asking questions about the house and the children in the weeks leading up to Christmas. Neighbors remembered unfamiliar figures near the property. None of these observations had seemed alarming at the time. In retrospect, they felt intrusive. When placed alongside the missing ladder, the disabled trucks, and the cut phone lines, they suggested reconnaissance rather than coincidence. The notion of retaliation began to surface, not as an accusation, but as a possibility. Could someone have sought to punish George by targeting what he loved most? Could the fire have been used not only to destroy property, but to conceal a more deliberate act? The Sodders were careful not to assert conclusions they could not prove. They framed these questions as open, unresolved, and dependent on evidence that had never been fully gathered. Some researchers and journalists later explored whether organized crime played any role. Italian-American organized crime did exist in mid-century America, but there is no verified evidence connecting it to the Sodder case. The family themselves did not claim such a link as fact. They acknowledged only that the social dynamics of the time, post-war tensions, immigrant politics, and lingering resentments, created a context in which threats could be made and, in rare cases, carried out. What made the motive question particularly troubling was how neatly it aligned with the mechanics of the fire. Interference with rescue, moving a ladder, disabling vehicles, cutting phone lines, suggested forethought. If the goal had been to ensure no one could reach the upstairs rooms, then the act was not random, it was engineered. And if the goal had been to remove the children alive, the fire would have served as a powerful diversion, one that redirected attention and eliminated immediate pursuit. Yet motive alone proves nothing. The Sodders understood this. They did not want a story that fit, they wanted one that could be proven. The problem was that the early investigation had closed the door on proof. Evidence had been buried, witnesses had not been thoroughly examined, timelines had not been tested against alternative explanations. The idea of arson had not been pursued with rigor. In that vacuum, motive became a lens rather than a conclusion. George's political views also influenced how some perceived him after the fire. To critics, his outspokenness made him seem combative, even paranoid when he questioned authorities. To supporters, it explained why he refused to accept convenient answers. The same trait that had made him visible before the fire now defined him after it, a refusal to be quiet when something felt wrong.
The Italian connection was never a single thread. It was a tapestry of context, immigration, politics, community dynamics, and personal history. It did not provide names or confessions. It did not produce arrests. What it did was add weight to the family's insistence that the fire should have been investigated as more than an accident. Importantly, the Sodders never claimed that all Italians or even their local community were responsible. They were precise in their language. If there was retaliation, they believed it would have been the work of individuals, not a group. They continued to live among their neighbors, many of whom supported them. Their concern was not with identity, but with behavior, threats made, systems sabotaged, and questions avoided. As years passed, this line of inquiry became part of the case's public narrative. Some embraced it as the missing motive that explained everything. Others rejected it as speculative. The truth remains that no direct evidence ever emerged to confirm retaliation. But absence of proof does not erase relevance, especially when early investigative failures prevented evidence from being properly gathered. The Italian connection also underscored a broader point about motive in unresolved cases. Motive is often invisible until it is examined early, when memories are fresh and evidence intact. When that window closes, motive becomes harder to establish, easier to dismiss, and more likely to be labeled conjecture. In the Sodder case, the window closed quickly. For the family, considering motive was not about assigning blame, it was about understanding. If someone had reason to harm them, that reason mattered. It meant the disappearance was not an inexplicable act of fate, but a human decision, terrifying but knowable. And if it was knowable, then it was possible that someone, somewhere, still carried the knowledge of what had happened. That possibility fueled the Sodders' persistence. They shared their concerns with investigators, journalists, and anyone willing to listen. They emphasized the threat from the insurance salesman, the pre-fire anomalies, and George's political outspokenness. They asked the same question repeatedly. If this had been anyone else, would the case have been closed so quickly? No definitive answer ever came. The Italian connection remains what it has always been, a context-rich avenue of inquiry that was never fully explored, neither confirmed nor disproven. It stands as a reminder that tragedies do not occur in isolation. They occur within communities, histories, and relationships that shape both events and responses. In the end, motive does not solve the Sodder case, but it sharpens it. It turns an accident into a question. It transforms coincidence into possibility, and it reinforces the family's central claim that what happened on that hillside was not simply the work of fire, but the result of human choices whose consequences were never fully examined.
The Sodders did not need motive to grieve. They needed it to understand. And without understanding, the mystery endured, rooted not just in ashes and absence, but in the unresolved tensions of a life lived loudly, visibly, and unwilling to look away. As the years passed and official interest in the Sodder case quietly dissolved, a new danger emerged, one far more final than fire or bureaucracy: forgetting. Not the forgetting of grief, which George and Jennie Sodder knew would never leave them, but the forgetting of the world outside their family, the slow erosion of attention that turns unresolved tragedies into footnotes. Investigations do not only fail because of missing evidence, they fail because time convinces people that unanswered questions no longer matter. George understood this instinctively. If the world stopped asking about his children, then whatever truth still existed would be buried forever. And so, in an act that would become one of the most enduring symbols of parental defiance in American true crime history, George Sodder chose visibility over silence. In the early 1950s, along a stretch of Route 16 in Fayette County, a road traveled daily by truck drivers, commuters, and strangers passing through Appalachia, he erected a large billboard. It was not dramatic in design. It did not accuse authorities or name suspects. It carried no theories. It asked a single question, written in stark, unmistakable letters: where are our children? Above those words were the faces of the 5 missing Sodder children: Maurice, Martha, Louis, Jennie, and Betty. Photographed before the fire, their expressions ordinary, unguarded, frozen at the ages they would never grow beyond. The simplicity of the sign was what made it unbearable to ignore. It did not sensationalize loss, it humanized it. Drivers could not dismiss it as fiction or spectacle. These were real children, and the question was not rhetorical. The billboard stood where movement was constant, where people were always going somewhere else, forcing them to confront a story that refused to move on. Some drivers slowed without realizing it. Others looked away, unsettled. Many remembered it long after they had passed. For the Sodders, the billboard was not about publicity or pressure. It was about preservation. George paid for it himself year after year, repairing weather damage, replacing faded photographs, and updating it as time moved forward. When age-progressed images became available, they were added, acknowledging what the official narrative refused to consider, that the children might have grown older somewhere beyond Fayetteville. The billboard became a permanent public missing persons notice in an era before national databases, Amber Alerts, or continuous media coverage. It turned a private loss into a public responsibility. The reactions in the community were mixed. Some neighbors admired the Sodders' refusal to surrender, seeing the sign as an act of courage and devotion. Others felt deeply uncomfortable. The billboard challenged the town's desire for closure. It contradicted the official explanation that the children had died in the fire. To some, it felt like an accusation, not of individuals, but of complacency. Yet that discomfort was precisely the point. The billboard did what reports and letters could not. It kept the question alive in the public consciousness. Travelers asked about it at gas stations and diners. Locals gave directions using it as a landmark. Journalists, encountering it years after the fire, began asking why it was still there. New articles were written. The case resurfaced again and again, refusing to settle into history. For Jennie Sodder, the billboard carried a meaning deeper than protest. As a mother, she had been denied every ritual that makes grief survivable. There were no bodies to bury, no graves to visit, no anniversaries of death to observe. She wore black for the rest of her life, a visible declaration that mourning had never ended because nothing had been resolved. The billboard became her substitute for a cemetery, a place where her children were acknowledged, remembered, and still sought. Every car that slowed felt like recognition. Every stranger who asked about the sign felt like proof that her children had not vanished completely. The billboard also became a conduit of information. Letters arrived from across the country. Phone calls came at all hours. Some were vague, some detailed, some hopeful, some cruel. People claimed to have seen the children years earlier, to have heard stories passed down through families, to have encountered individuals who resembled the Sodders. Many leads went nowhere. Some were honest mistakes, others were hoaxes. But among them were reports sincere enough to keep doubt alive. George followed as many as he could, traveling when health and finances allowed, showing photographs, asking questions, chasing even the smallest possibility. What mattered was not that every tip was true, it was that people were still looking. The billboard ensured that the Sodder children were not reduced to a closed file or an assumption accepted by time. It transformed the case from a local tragedy into a living question asked daily of thousands of strangers. Officials were not always pleased. Some viewed the sign as an implicit criticism of the investigation, a reminder of unresolved failure. Others worried it encouraged speculation and false hope. But the Sodders did not erect the billboard to satisfy authorities. They built it because silence felt like betrayal. As decades passed, the billboard aged along with George and Jennie. Paint faded, wood weathered, photographs were replaced again and again, yet the message never changed. It stood through storms, seasons, and social change, watching traffic move steadily forward while the question it asked remained frozen in time. George eventually died without answers. Jennie lived on for years, still wearing black, still believing.
The billboard outlived them both. For the surviving Sodder siblings, it became legacy and burden, a symbol of their parental refusal to accept erasure. Even when the sign was finally removed, its power did not fade. Images of it circulated in books, articles, and documentaries. The billboard had already done its work. It had made forgetting impossible. It ensured that the disappearance of the Sodder children would not quietly dissolve into history. It preserved the case not through proof, but through insistence. The fire destroyed a house. Time claimed the parents. But the billboard stood for decades as a silent witness, asking the same question of every passing year, every passing stranger. Where are our children? And as long as that question remains unanswered, the Sodder story does not end. It waits.
By the time the photograph arrived, the Sodder family had learned to live inside uncertainty so completely that hope itself felt dangerous, something to be handled carefully, like a fragile object that could shatter without warning. And yet, when the envelope appeared, plain, unmarked, carrying no return address, it carried a weight unlike any letter that had come before it, because this one did not offer rumor or theory or second-hand testimony, but an image, something tangible enough to be held, stared at, and argued over. And for George and Jennie Sodder, that alone was enough to reopen wounds they had never truly been allowed to close. The photograph arrived in 1967, more than 20 years after the fire, at a time when most of the world had quietly accepted the official explanation and moved on. And inside the envelope was a single picture of a young man, dark-haired, dark-eyed, his expression neutral, his posture unremarkable, standing against what appeared to be a plain background, offering no obvious clues about location or circumstance. And yet, the moment Jennie saw it, she felt something unmistakable, a recognition that bypassed logic and went straight to instinct, the kind only a mother claims to know, because the face in the photograph bore a striking resemblance to Louis Sodder, one of the 5 children believed to have died in the fire, and not the Louis frozen in childhood photographs, but an older version, a grown man shaped by time, exactly as Jennie had imagined her son might look if he had lived. On the back of the photograph were a few handwritten words, awkwardly spaced, imperfectly spelled, and chilling in their ambiguity. Louis Sodder, I love brother Frankie, ill boys, A90132 or 35. There was no explanation of who had written it, no clarification of what the numbers meant, no indication of why the photograph had been sent, only the suggestion of identity and connection, and that suggestion alone was enough to unsettle everything the family thought they understood about their loss. For Jennie, the photograph became something close to proof, not scientific proof, not legal proof, but emotional certainty, because the resemblance felt too precise, too personal to dismiss easily, and she clung to it as evidence that her refusal to accept the fire narrative had been justified all along, that her children might truly have survived and grown older somewhere beyond reach, while George, ever more cautious, studied the photograph with restraint, comparing it to childhood images of Louis, noting similarities in the eyes, the shape of the nose, the jawline, but also acknowledging that resemblance alone could not confirm identity, especially after 2 decades, when faces change and memory reshapes perception. Still, neither of them could explain why someone would send such a photograph anonymously, unless there was meaning behind it, unless someone wanted to be seen but not found, recognized but not traced. The Sodders sought expert opinions, showing the photograph to investigators and specialists familiar with facial comparison, who offered mixed assessments, some noting strong similarities, others warning that coincidence and subjective interpretation could not be ruled out, but no one could conclusively identify the man or trace the photograph's origin, and without a postmark or sender, the image existed in isolation, untethered to any verifiable trail. The handwritten message only deepened the mystery, especially the phrase, I love brother Frankie, which suggested a direct familial bond and implied knowledge that would have been difficult for a stranger to fabricate convincingly.
while the cryptic numbers defied interpretation, possibly referencing an identification number, a prison record, a military code, or nothing meaningful at all, leaving investigators with more questions than answers. George attempted to follow one tentative lead that suggested the photograph may have originated in Kentucky, traveling when his health allowed, asking questions, showing the image to anyone who might recognize the man. But time worked against him. His records were incomplete, memories unreliable, and the trail dissolved into silence just like so many others before it. To skeptics, the photograph was another cruel coincidence, a look-alike amplified by grief, or worse, an intentional hoax designed to exploit a family's pain. And while that possibility could not be dismissed, it did not fully account for the specificity of the message or the timing of its arrival, decades after the fire, when public attention had waned and there was little to gain from deception. For Jennie, the photograph became something she could not let go of. She kept it close for the rest of her life, returning to it again and again, studying its details, tracing the contours of the face with her eyes, imagining the life her son might have lived beyond the frame. And while she understood that certainty might never come, she believed the photograph was not random, that it represented a deliberate act by someone who knew the truth and chose, for reasons unknown, to reveal only a fragment of it. The photograph also unsettled the surviving Sodder siblings, some of whom saw immediate resemblance and felt a resurgence of belief, while others struggled with the emotional toll of reopening a mystery that had defined their entire lives. Because if the man in the image truly was Louis, it meant that their brother had lived for decades without contact, perhaps under constraint, perhaps under fear, perhaps believing his family was dead. And if it was not Louis, then the photograph was yet another reminder of how easily hope could be manipulated in the absence of answers. What made the photograph especially haunting was that no follow-up ever came. No second letter, no clarification, no attempt to claim or deny responsibility. Just silence, leaving the image suspended between revelation and illusion. A single artifact that neither confirmed survival nor allowed the family to move on. After George's death in 1969, the photograph took on additional weight, becoming part of the families of answered questions, and after Jennie's death in 1989, it remained as one of the last tangible connections to her belief that the fire had not taken her children, only hidden them. In later years, the photograph would be reproduced in books, articles, and documentaries, often presented as the most tantalizing piece of evidence in the entire case, not because it solved anything, but because it refused to be explained away completely, embodying the central tension of the Sodder mystery, the coexistence of possibility and uncertainty. It stands as a reminder that some clues arrive without context, that some truths are hinted at rather than revealed, and that in cases where early investigative failures erase definitive answers, fragments like this can carry enormous emotional power without providing resolution. To this day, no one has conclusively identified the man in the photograph, no record has been found to link the image to a known individual, and no explanation has emerged for why it was sent or what message it was meant to convey, leaving it suspended in the same unresolved space as the case itself. The photograph doesn't prove that Louis Sodder survived the fire, but it also does not allow the possibility to be dismissed entirely, and in that way it mirrors the entire story of the Sodder children, a story defined not by what is known, but by what cannot be conclusively denied, where absence becomes evidence, and a single image arriving decades too late and offering nothing but suggestion becomes one of the most haunting symbols of a mystery that refuses to end.
By the time the Sodder case entered its third and fourth decades, it no longer lived in the realm of active investigation, but in a quieter, more unsettling space where unresolved questions linger without expectation of answers. And yet, for the Sodder family, silence never meant peace. It meant endurance. The world moved forward in visible ways. Towns expanded, highways widened, records aged, witnesses died, and institutions shifted their priorities to newer tragedies. But for those who had lived through the fire and its aftermath, time did not soften the mystery, it only made its edges sharper. George Sodder died in 1969 without knowing what happened to his children, carrying doubt to his grave with the same stubborn resolve that had driven him for more than 2 decades. Jennie Sodder lived 20 more years, wearing black every day as a declaration that mourning was not complete, that the story had no ending. When she died in 1989, she left behind not answers, but conviction, the belief that her children had not perished in the fire, only vanished into a truth the world had chosen not to pursue fully. With their deaths, the most relentless voices in the search fell silent, and the case entered a new phase defined not by action, but by legacy. The surviving Sodder siblings grew older, carrying a burden unlike most families, one shaped not only by loss, but by ambiguity, because grief can be mourned, but uncertainty must be carried. They had grown up in the shadow of missing siblings who never aged alongside them, whose faces remained frozen in photographs while the rest of the world changed. For them, the Sodder case was not a historical mystery, it was their childhood, their family dinners, their holidays, their identity. Each Christmas reopened wounds, not because of memories of the fire alone, but because of everything that followed: the disbelief, the resistance, the unanswered letters, the roads traveled in hope, and the constant awareness that something essential had never been resolved. As decades passed, the practical realities of time worked against the truth. Evidence that might once have been examined was gone. The fire site had been bulldozed. Physical traces were buried or destroyed. Witnesses who might have clarified timelines or confirmed sightings passed away, taking their memories with them. Records from the 1940s and 1950s were incomplete or lost. Phone logs, vehicle registrations, and travel records that could have corroborated sightings simply no longer existed. Even if someone had wanted to reopen the case fully, the tools required to do so had largely disappeared. Law enforcement agencies, when asked about the case in later years, reiterated the same position: there was insufficient evidence to pursue further investigation. The fire, they maintained, explained the deaths. The inconsistencies were attributed to trauma, poor record-keeping, and the limitations of the era. From an institutional standpoint, the case was closed, not because it had been solved, but because reopening it would likely yield no prosecutable outcome. Yet this administrative finality clashed with scientific and logical discomfort that never fully faded. Fire experts continued to note, even decades later, that the complete destruction of 5 bodies in a residential house fire was extraordinarily unlikely. The absence of bones and teeth remained unexplained. The cut phone lines, the missing ladder, the disabled trucks, and the delayed fire response were never reconciled into a coherent narrative. The false identification of animal remains as human tissue was never formally corrected in official records. Each unresolved element stood as a quiet contradiction to the certainty that had been declared so quickly in 1945. Over time, the Sodder case took on symbolic weight beyond the family itself. Writers, historians, and true crime researchers revisited it periodically, drawn not by sensationalism, but by its refusal to fit neatly into any category. It was not a simple accident, yet no crime was ever proven. It was not a confirmed kidnapping, yet the absence of remains kept that possibility alive. It was not a solved case, yet it was officially treated as one. This contradiction classed the Sodder mystery in a unique and uncomfortable position within American history, a story that resisted both closure and classification. Each new generation that encountered the case asked the same questions the Sodders had decades earlier, often with fresh frustration at how quickly early investigative opportunities had been lost. Why was the fire scene not preserved? Why were forensic experts not consulted immediately? Why were witness accounts dismissed rather than examined? Why was the foundation bulldozed before definitive conclusions were reached? These questions did not accuse specific individuals so much as expose systemic fragility, the way urgency fades, assumptions harden, and uncertainty becomes inconvenient.
For the surviving Sodder siblings who remained, the passage of time brought a painful clarity. Answers might never come, not because they did not exist, but because the moment to uncover them had passed. Yet even this realization did not bring acceptance. Instead, it deepened a sense of responsibility, to memory, to truth, and to the idea that unresolved stories matter even when solutions are no longer possible. They continued to speak about the case when asked, careful not to exaggerate, careful not to claim what could not be proven, but firm in their insistence that the official explanation had never fully accounted for the facts. They understood how easily unresolved cases are dismissed as legends or folklore, but they also understood that legends often begin where investigation ends too soon. As technology advanced, some wondered whether modern forensic methods could one day revisit the case. DNA testing, digital facial recognition, archival reconstruction. But without physical evidence, such tools offered limited hope. The Sodder mystery remained anchored in what was missing rather than what was found. That absence became its defining feature. 5 children vanished on Christmas Eve, and no trace of their bodies was ever recovered. Everything else, the sightings, the photograph, the theories, the motives, orbited that single, immovable fact. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the Sodder case faded further from living memory, but it never disappeared entirely. It resurfaced online, in documentaries, in podcasts, and in discussions about America's most haunting unsolved mysteries. Each retelling stripped away some speculation and added new reflection, but none could escape the same conclusion. The case was unfinished. And perhaps that's its lasting power. Not every story ends with answers. Not every loss is resolved. The Sodder case stands as a reminder that uncertainty itself can be a form of suffering, one that extends beyond those directly affected and into the collective conscience. It forces uncomfortable reflection about how societies handle tragedy, how quickly closure is prioritized over truth, and how easily unresolved questions are allowed to fade when they become inconvenient. The Sodder children never received graves, never received death certificates grounded in proof, never received a final chapter. Instead, they became symbols of an unanswered question carried forward by those who refused to forget. Decades of silence followed the fire, but it was not the silence of resolution. It was the silence of something unfinished, echoing softly through time, reminding anyone willing to listen that 5 children left their home one winter night and never returned, and that sometimes the most haunting mysteries are not defined by what we do not know, but how easily we stop asking.
The fire on the hillside above Fayetteville ended before sunrise on Christmas Day, 1945, but what followed did not end with smoke or ash. It stretched outward, quietly and relentlessly, across decades, generations, and memory, becoming something far larger than a single family's tragedy. In the immediate aftermath, officials believed they were closing a case, restoring order, and allowing a town to move forward. In reality, they were sealing a wound that would never heal properly, because closure was declared without certainty, and certainty was replaced with silence. 5 children vanished in a house fire that left no graves, no remains, and no proof of death, and that absence became the defining legacy of the Sodder case, not the flames, not the ruins, but what was missing. The story endures because it exposes a profound discomfort at the heart of human understanding, that some losses resist explanation, that not every question yields to time, and that truth, once overlooked, may never be recovered. The Sodder children became symbols not because their case was sensational, but because it was unfinished. Fire is meant to destroy and clarify, to leave behind wreckage that confirms what has been lost. Yet here, destruction produced uncertainty instead of resolution, and uncertainty reshaped grief into something permanent and unresolved. George and Jennie Sodder spent the rest of their lives living between belief and doubt, unable to bury their children and unwilling to accept conclusions unsupported by evidence.
Their persistence transformed a local tragedy into a national mystery, not through spectacle, but through refusal. Refusal to accept silence as truth, refusal to let memory fade, refusal to surrender their children to paperwork and assumption. Their billboard once stood beside the highway, asking a question no authority could answer, and even after it came down, that question remained suspended in public consciousness, echoing quietly through articles, books, and retellings. As years passed, the Sodder case began to represent more than a single disappearance. It became a mirror reflecting the limits of investigation and the consequences of haste. Early decisions, bulldozing the site, dismissing inconsistencies, failing to preserve evidence, could not be undone. Opportunities were lost in the hours when clarity mattered most, and once lost, they were never recovered. The case illustrates how quickly certainty can replace curiosity, how easily systems prioritize finality over understanding, and how devastating that choice can be for those left behind. It also forces a reckoning with the nature of grief itself. Grief with proof allows mourning to move forward. Grief without proof traps families in a perpetual present, forever waiting for something, confirmation, discovery, confession, that never comes. For the Sodders, time did not close the wound, it only carried it forward. Their surviving children grew old beneath the weight of siblings who never aged alongside them, their lives shaped by absence and unanswered questions. The Sodder story persists because it refuses to fit into a comfortable narrative. It cannot be neatly categorized as an accident because evidence contradicts that simplicity. It cannot be confirmed as a crime because proof was lost before it could be gathered. It exists instead in the uneasy space between possibility and doubt, where neither belief nor skepticism fully satisfies. Fire experts still question the lack of remains. Witness accounts still unsettle official explanations. The photograph that arrived decades later still resists dismissal. Each fragment alone proves nothing. Together, they ensure the story cannot rest. In this way, the Sodder case stands as a reminder that history is shaped not only by what is known, but by what remains unresolved. Some mysteries endure, not because answers are impossible, but because they were not pursued when pursuit mattered most. The legacy of the Sodder children is not defined by theories or speculation, but by remembrance and responsibility. The responsibility to acknowledge uncertainty, to respect unanswered questions, and to resist the temptation to replace truth with convenience. Their story challenges the assumption that time heals all wounds, revealing instead that time can deepen them when clarity is denied. It also challenges listeners and readers to consider how many similar stories have faded without notice, how many families have carried silence instead of answers, and how often certainty is declared simply because it is easier than doubt. The Sodder children left their home on Christmas Eve and never returned. They left no graves behind, only a question that has outlived their parents, their investigators, and nearly everyone who witnessed the fire itself. That question remains not because it demands belief in any single theory, but because it demands honesty about what is unknown. In the end, the Sodder case offers no solution, no revelation, no final truth to uncover. What it offers instead is a legacy of vigilance, a reminder that unresolved stories deserve attention, that absence matters, and that silence should never be mistaken for closure. The fire ended in hours, but the mystery did not. It remains suspended in time, carried forward by memory and doubt, asking quietly, persistently, and without accusation, what really happened to the Sodder children. And as long as that question remains unanswered, their story does not conclude. It waits.